Bismillah, Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Rania Awad, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Madistan. Last year, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, it became clear that the public health, social, economic, and educational upheavals were exacerbating an already critical mental health vacuum in Muslim communities. To top that, there was very concerning research coming out of my lab at Stanford University, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab. We understood that Muslims were uniquely at risk at the rise of Islamophobia, institutional discrimination at all levels of society, and considerable mental health barriers from community stigma. Now, while the Stanford lab was producing research that was far-reaching in impact and importance, there was no community-facing partner that could take this crucial research, synthesize it, and help modify the Muslim mental health narrative through community outreach, educational programming, workshops, and trainings. And because conversations surrounding mental health have been held with strong suspicion and wariness in our Muslim communities, despite our very rich Islamic heritage dedicated to psychological well-being, if anyone managed to overcome the stigma of seeking mental health support today, they're often finding themselves unable to find, access, or afford professional therapists who offer religiously and culturally congruent care to address the Muslim communities. Alhamdulillah, 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, and through a unique collaboration between Stanford's Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab and a community advisory board of Muslim leaders and mental health professionals, Madistan was born in the blessed month of Ramadan. I'm often asked, what does Madistan mean? It is the shortened word for Bimaristan. Bimar means the ill person, and stan is the place of. Now, in Arabic, this is also the daughter Shifa. In our Islamic heritage, the Bimaristans were hospitals found all throughout Muslim lands. And what really inspired us to choose the name Madistan is the astonishing fact that it was the Muslims who designed the very first hospitals in human history to have psychiatric wards and pay this close attention to mental health. We at Madistan today want to revive that tradition and break free of the stigma against mental health that is crippling our communities. And alhamdulillah, less than 1 year, we have been able to work hard towards that goal. Allow me to share with you what I mean. We've been invited to present at 3 national convenings announced by the White House of the United States. These trainings were partnered with the U.S. Department of Human Health Services, the HHS, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and also present for the State of Colorado Suicide Commission. On all of these national platforms, we were asked for our expert advice on Muslim mental health, particularly the difficult topic of suicide. It's been a real honor to speak on these platforms, and it also speaks to what we bring to the table. In our first year at Madistan, we've been featured in at least 75 different news outlets like the Associated Press, NPR, the New York Times, the Tribune, CBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, and so many more across the country and the globe. There's been at least 85 news articles written about our work in just under a year, including our own opinion pieces or op-eds featured in USA Today and Religion News Services, co-authored by leading Islamic voices like Sheikh Omar Suleiman and others. And at the national Muslim community level, we have officially hosted the first suicide response trainings custom-tailored for Muslims and have trained more than 250 imams, religious leaders, community leaders, with more planned on the way. We have a dedicated team of 7 individuals working on just that project alone. And in this past year at Madistan, we hosted 15 workshops and seminars, healing circles and learning circles that cover topics like coping with COVID, harvesting resilience, spiritual abuse, finding closure in complicated grief, domestic violence, navigating family dynamics, betrayal and hypocrisy, mental health in our Black Muslim communities, and much more. Our educational programs have generated over 10,000 views collectively, and we post on major social media platforms nearly daily about mental health information for Muslims for the thousands of our followers. On the clinic side, we're so excited to share with you that our team at Madistan has grown to 10 clinicians between our Muslim Mental Health Initiative on college campuses like UC Berkeley and Stanford University, and in our clinic itself. And we're so excited to tell you about it, the soft launch of our Madistan clinic, which we hope to do a full launch with your support this year, inshallah. Speaking of your support, this is where we need your help. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "There is no disease that Allah has created except that He has also created its treatment." There is a high demand amongst Muslims to meet mental health professionals who can help them. Muslims are struggling with high-stake mental health issues and are being left untreated and on long wait lists. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are trying to seek out treatment, but we need your support to provide it with the official launch of our clinic. With your support, we can officially launch Madistan's holistic mental health clinic this year and ensure that we're able to meet the high demands of therapy, provide professional and affordable clinical mental health care for our Muslim sisters and brothers. We look forward to your financial support and, most importantly, to your du'as.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most gracious and the dispenser of grace. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sara Mustafavi, and I am a co-founder and deputy director of Maristan. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to Maristan tonight and to this healing circle, remembering our brothers in Albuquerque. To those of you who are new, Maristan was born just 16 months ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, just as the nation was beginning to recognize a very critical mental health crisis. Born of two organizational parents, the Community Advisory Board on Muslim Mental Health in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as the Stanford Lab on Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology, a contingent of dedicated community members joined Dr. Rania in founding this organization. So all of this came out of a real deep void and vacuum in our community and our desire to fill it and address those concerns. As noted on the screen, okay, I think we've moved ahead. I wanted to just kind of go over the mission, inshallah. But essentially, Maristan aims to advance holistic mental and spiritual wellness in our community through our programmatic areas, including Maristan's mental health clinic, which was mentioned in the video. This provides professional, religiously congruent, accessible, and affordable mental health therapy for all. Maristan's MMHI programs, the Muslim Mental Health Initiatives, working with UC Berkeley and Stanford to provide culturally and religiously congruent mental health care, therapy, and support group services for Muslim students on campus. And then we have three areas of educational programming: our healing circles, which you are here joining us tonight to partake in, our learning circles, and our trainings. And I won't go through everything, but I will highlight our 500 Imam campaign, which is an 8-hour certification training for religious leaders and community gatekeepers in suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. We've already had a virtual training and an in-person training in the Midwest, and are planning our 2 other trainings on the East Coast and in the South, inshallah, later this year. So our healing circles, in our healing circles, we create safe spaces to address the mental health impact of emergent crises from around the world. We bring clinicians and leading voices to help navigate these crises, to promote well-being, healing, and to support our attendees. Topics from the past include the crises in Afghanistan, the crises in Palestine, to spiritual abuse here, and domestic violence at home. After this panel discussion, we will close off the recording to allow for a safe space for attendees to share their thoughts, reflections, and to ask for the speakers' questions. We also have an agreement with our attendees, the Healing Circle Agreement. This is, as I mentioned, a safe space. The shared microphone segment will not be recorded. The speakers section will be, but not the shared microphone portion. All people and their emotions are welcome here. This conversation is apolitical. Please be mindful of what you say and any possible triggering scenarios. Disclose your name if you choose. Keep comments relevant to our current discussion tonight. Please keep comments short to allow everyone an opportunity to share. And please, no disrespect or derogatory commentary will be tolerated. In the events leading up to this healing circle, anti-Shia hatred fueled the killings of 4 Muslim Americans in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this has sent shockwaves throughout our Muslim community. I'll speak for myself and say that I had been lulled into a notion that this type of violence, unfortunately, only happened overseas. However, any of these brothers could have been my brother, my father, my husband, or my cousin. And so I'd like to take a moment to say their names. Naim Hussein was a 25-year-old who had left Pakistan fleeing persecution as a minority Shia Muslim when he was gunned down. His death came just days after Muhammad Afzal Hussein, age 27. Aftab Hussein, age 41, was also from Pakistan and attended the same masjid. And the earliest case involves the November killing of Muhammad Ahmadi, age 62. This is all doubly painful for the Shia community, as the realization of these crimes and the impetus behind them came in Muharram. So we are all brokenhearted for the families of those slain, and we are brokenhearted for the sectarian violence in the United States. But just as Rumi reminds us, the wound is the point through which life enters us. The wound is the point through which light enters us. And so we take this sorrow and we take this grief and we recognize that this pain must be transformed and must not be transmitted. So we come together, Sunni and Shia alike, all Muslims, to foster understanding, to deepen our commitment to unity, and to strengthen our love for one another. In terms of tonight's objectives, we plan on providing a healing space for the tragedies that occurred in Albuquerque, to raise awareness regarding anti-Shia hate in our community, and to learn how to increase our love, compassion, and unity as an ummah. Imam Khalid Latif is the university chaplain for NYU and executive director of the Islamic Center at NYU. Imam Latif co-founded and became the board president of Pillars of Peace, a nonprofit established in order to address a gap in appropriate services for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence from all backgrounds, and in particular within the Muslim community. He's also an adjunct associate professor of public service at NYU. And there's much, much more that I can say, but in the interest of time, I'm being brief here. Shaykh Faiyez Jaffer is an adjunct assistant professor of public service at NYU. He is also an assistant research scholar for the Islamic Center at NYU and an associate chaplain for the Center of Global and Spiritual Life at NYU. For his classical Islamic education, Fayez studied in the Seminary of Karbala, Iraq, one of the most prominent centers for Islamic learning. Dr. Rania Awad is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. She's a practicing psychiatrist, a director of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, and director of the Rahma Foundation and Maristan. Sister Zainab Hossaini is a PhD candidate at Stanford University and an associate clinical social worker focused on the mental health and well-being of women, with a master's degree in education from Harvard and an MSW from the University of Michigan. She engaged in research collaborations with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to evaluate available psychosocial and educational services for refugees within Iran. Okay, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Rania to go over the next section.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I welcome everybody that's here. I'm so happy that you're here, especially our guests for today, Imam Khalid Latif and Shaykh Faiyez. Inshallah, we're so happy to have you both. And we're really looking forward to a discussion, a difficult one for sure, but one that is highly important and one that we really wanted to make space for. So I thank you, and I ask everybody, inshallah, here to please look to the notes that we had given earlier about the way we run our healing circles. We will, inshallah, start right after my introduction here with, inshallah, the discussions from both Imam Khalid and Shaykh Faiyez, and then from there we will have time to hear your questions and your discussions, inshallah. Before I do that, I just wanted to say a couple of things related to for people that are victimized by violent hate crimes, as Sarah has just mentioned to us, that our brother is in Albuquerque, rahimahumullah, they are likely to experience, people who are victimized in this way are likely to experience more psychological distress than others who have not experienced such a thing. All of us now, everybody in this room has been now and has experienced our brother's deaths, and also, I'm sure, others around the world and in our own circles. And so by extension, all of us actually need to talk about healing and to really understand how to be able to move forward, inshallah. Those who have been victimized specifically on violent, on religiously motivated violent hate crimes are really more likely to experience what we call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorders. Or you can even say chronic stress disorders if it's an ongoing issue, as we know for so many various communities within our Muslim families. Also, they are also more likely to experience safety concerns, depression, anxiety, anger, more so than others that have not experienced anything like this, or have experienced hate crimes that are not motivated by bias in the way these are. And so I want to make sure that we set the tone here for a safe space, inshallah, and know, please, that the two biggest motivators for hate crimes actually tends to be either race and ethnicity, at about 58% according to the literature, or religion, at about 22% according to the literature. So I just give us these stats and backgrounds to preface our discussion today. And now, inshallah, I'm going to turn the mic over to Shaykh Faiyez, and I'm going to then come back a little bit later to discuss with you some of the questions that you all have. So please, inshallah, start noting these down, because we'd love to hear your voices very soon. Fatafadal, Shaykh.
Thank you so much, Doctor. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and peace and everlasting blessings be upon the best of his creation, our messenger Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam, and his immaculate family. Thank you to the Marston team for having me and for hosting obviously this really, really important and timely discussion. Let me begin by perhaps stating that the religion of Islam, like many of us may know, is born in the 6th century Arabian Peninsula. As our Prophet, alayhi salam, he sought to eradicate a lot of the injustices and inequities in his local community in the Arabian Peninsula, and sought to bring us out of darkness into light and out of ignorance into knowledge. And we see this through many verses of the Holy Quran, as well as through many of his ahadith and traditions, where God states, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. And in a hadith, where the Messenger of God, he states, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمْ مَكَارِمُ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that I have been sent with one ultimate objective, and that is to perfect the etiquette of the ummah. And so we see this really strong stress on core common values that the Messenger of God sought toward demonstrating, sought toward illuminating during his time in Mecca and later on in Medina. And naturally, we as believers are consistently seeking to putting forth our best effort toward walking in those sacred footsteps of the Prophet ﷺ, so that we are able to be those who emanate that light, who are able to reach that pinnacle of knowledge, who are able to be amongst those who truly act in the way that the Messenger of God acted during the course of his life, and make the differences that he did during the course of his life. I say all of this as an introduction because the bullet points that I was asked to speak on, or to really sort of set the framework for our conversation this evening, at least in my 10, 15 minutes or so, is to start to define the Shia Muslim tradition. And I would say that the fact that we start the conversation in that way demonstrates the sort of dire need to have conversations like these a lot more often. Because whether you travel to the East or you travel to the West, more likely than not, we're not going to be hosting gatherings that are seeking to define Sunni Muslim tradition. Because the normative in our communities and in our culture is Sunni Islam. And therefore, by default, Shia Islam is immediately otherized. And that's really, really important place for us to start, recognizing again that the ultimate mission of the Messenger of God, alayhi salam, is to set this tone and create this framework whereby he seeks toward teaching us how to act with beautiful and perfect etiquette. And when the Messenger of God passes away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in that very first or second and third century of Islam, there is a whole host of various theological schools that pop up. And for those of you who might be familiar with Islamic history, there were literally dozens. It was not relegated towards Shia or Sunni, but there were dozens all across not only the Arabian Peninsula, but across contemporary Iraq, contemporary Persia, and really all across the Middle East, as far as the Muslim empire spread in those initial 100 or 150 years, there were as many Muslim theological groups that came to rise. And amongst them were this Shia Muslim minority, which also presented themselves, again, in the early period of the Islamic, immediately, virtually thereafter, after the passing of our Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And slowly over the course of several decades, there was a formulation of a distinct theology, a distinct law, and a distinct school of ethics slash spirituality. If we sort of cut back on all of the semantics, and we fast forward till today, we estimate that out of the more than, or close to 2 billion Muslims that there are all across the world, approximately 10 to 20% of them are Shia Muslims. And in addition to that, approximately 10 to 20% of Muslims in the United States, which is anywhere between 3 and 5 Muslims, 3 and 5 million Muslims in the United States, also identify as a Shia Muslim. What does a Shia mean? The word Shia literally means someone who is an adherent to or loyal to. And the term has been semanticized toward demonstrating that anyone who believed theologically that Ali, the son of Abu Talib, who is the cousin, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was appointed after the Messenger of God to assume the responsibility of religious leadership in the early Muslim community, that they would be defined as a Shia, meaning someone who adhered or was loyal to Ali alayhi salam. And thereafter, Shia Muslims began to formulate this theology on the basis of love and adoration and adherence to the teachings of not only the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but thereafter, by extension, his family, most namely the daughter of the Prophet and their 2 children, Hassan and Hussein. So the Messenger of God, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein, and these 5 personalities form virtually the ethos of Muslim theology, law, and jurisprudence, and ethics and spirituality for the majority of Shia Muslims. We believe for them to be not only prominent in their respective positions because they are members of the family of the Prophet, but in addition to that, we believe that they have been endowed with unique knowledge and gifts and talents by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and thus our love for them is an obligation, and seeking toward walking in their footsteps is amongst the most important and primary of our objectives. I say all of this again as an introduction to really phase into sort of point 2 of the conversation, which really perhaps sets the framework for a lot of what we unfortunately experienced over the course of this last month, and the unfortunate tragedies in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This theological school, again, that was born in the very early days of the religion of Islam, has been minoritized for more than 1,000 years. And if you take a look at the history and sort of the semantics being created not only by many Muslim groups, but in addition to by a lot of Western academia, Shia Muslims are consistently marginalized or isolated toward one corner of the larger Muslim community and its ethos. And due to that, there are a lot of misconceptions and a real failure to understand not only our theology and our law and our ritual and our practice, but even sort of a dismissal of the fact for many that Shia Muslims are even within the fold of the religion of Islam, which contributes, unfortunately, to a lot of the rhetoric, and then thereafter, a lot of the violence that we see, not only that which we witness in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but unfortunately that which is experienced by Shia Muslims all across the world today. Just to give you a little bit of insight, a couple of days after this really awful tragedy targeting these 4 brothers in this anti-Shia killing in Albuquerque, New Mexico, almost every community that I've visited thereafter and individuals that I've spoken to with any intimacy regarding this tragedy, I had upwards of 24 people who have come to me and told me about tragedies, violence, even, perhaps genocides that their families or their communities have experienced in different parts of the world because they identify as Shia. Some in Iraq, some in Afghanistan, some in Pakistan, that all across the world, Shia Muslims are unfortunately marginalized and isolated to the extent that literally they fear for their life in many pockets and in many places across the world. The only thing that is different in the fact that it transpired here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is that we don't necessarily have this perception or awareness or understanding that something like this tragic could truly take place in our own communities. And so when we try to understand what is it that we as a Shia Muslim community are encountering or facing today, the only thing that has changed is the realization or actualization that there is real potential for violence to inflict our communities today. We are currently in the month of Muharram, as our sister mentioned earlier. And during the month of Muharram, we often spend a great deal of time in our mosques and our Islamic centers, out of our love for the Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon them, in recollecting the tragedy of Hussein, the grandson of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And during the course of just the last several weeks, I've visited various different communities across the country. And many of them were telling me and demonstrating to me just how much money they've had to invest in security for their local mosques and centers during the course of these nights and days of Muharram, just because of this fear of a potential threat, inflicting their children, their women, their elderly members of their community. Upwards of $250,000, a mosque just told me that I was visiting this past weekend, told me that they spend yearly on security and how much they've had to ramp that up because of a fear. Because of a fear, again, that they will not be able to be themselves and practice openly and adequately in the way that they choose to. I want you to think for just a moment how tragic that is. And to truly understand then that the only thing that most individuals are seeking to do is just practice the way that they want to practice, to find or to cultivate the sense of belonging, where because Shia Muslims are minoritized, again, in so many pockets across this country, that these distinct mosques and places of worship are created so that we can join in community. And now there is a fear that we wouldn't be able to practice openly in the way that we choose to because of all of these external forces. And I know that there'll be others who are speaking to the reality and to the call to action, and our sister's soon going to be speaking about the mental health challenges that many Shia Muslims face. Let me just sort of conclude with this point. That consistent, anti-Shia Muslim rhetoric in mosques and Islamic centers on social media, and consistently seeing others who perpetuate that sort of language without any understanding of our theology, of our law, of our school of ethics, our school of spirituality, whatever it might be, consistently perpetuates this sort of behavior. And so to my friends who are observing, who are watching this evening, where you are confused or you're unaware or it's too difficult to understand the dynamics of different Shia Muslim or different Muslim sects or different schools of theology, then go out and learn. Where I can prove to be a resource, I'm happy to prove to be one. You can feel free to reach out to me at any time. Where you see friends, where you see colleagues, where you see people in your own mosques or Islamic centers perpetuating this behavior by mocking or speaking poorly about people who identify as Shia Muslim. And if you remain quiet and complacent while that's going on, again, it could be potentially contributing to the violence that we saw in places like Albuquerque, New Mexico, or in Balochistan, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or anywhere else across the world. So where you can call it out, where you can correct them, where you can advise them to adequate resources, please do so. I have 2 children. My daughter Zainab is 7 years old. My younger daughter Maryam, she is 5 years old. Every single day, I work with a body of predominantly Shia Muslim students, but at our center at the Islamic Center at New York University, we seek toward creating this unique space which allows for Muslim college students to grow, to cultivate, to embrace their religious identity, but at the same time to see the diversity within this Muslim community. And every day when I come home, I look back at my children and I wonder if they're going to go to a place, they're going to enter into this world when they're outside of the protection of their parents, with a fear that they may not come back home, or with a fear that someone is going to mock them or say something to them, or God forbid, perform an act of aggression or violence just because they're a Muslim in this incredibly Islamophobic world. But in addition to that, to add this additional layer, that for many of us, we feel that we are not exactly safe, even in a Muslim space, because of all of the anti-Shia Muslim rhetoric that we encounter, again, even within this country. To assume and to believe that this is not a problem that we encounter, unfortunately, in the United States, this super tragic incident in Albuquerque, New Mexico, should be an opportunity for us to open our eyes and realize that this fear is real, but the opportunity to make a difference now and end this violence in our communities is also very real. So where we can act, where we can call out, where we can seek toward learning and making a difference, inshallah ta'ala, today, this evening is the beginning of a conversation that we start to hopefully be those who make a real difference in our communities. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm assuming that I'm going to go next, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this very important conversation. I think it's appreciated by people of all walks of life because of the importance of the conversation, but the hurt that many have experienced, not just around this particular tragedy that has happened, but also the historical trauma that exists around the subject. I just like to express my appreciation for the space that exists for us to be able to have this conversation. So in order to frame the mental health and psychological well-being of the Shia Muslim population, I would like to, what I'm going to do is to share 4 broad psychological ideas and then have us kind of delve into those ideas as it pertains to this subject. And those 4 areas are intersectionality, speaking of resilience, a concept called allostatic load, and then contextualizing experiences. Let's start by talking about intersectionality and how it can influence a person's psychological well-being. Intersectionality essentially refers to the idea that the different identities, social identities that a person holds, can influence how their social experiences within the different communities that they navigate on a daily basis. So if you are a person who has a racial identity, and then you may have an ethnic identity, and then you may have a like your gender, socioeconomic status, the different groupings that you experience in society plays a number of functions. It can enable you to build an identity. It enables you to know your place within society and be able to operate within it. What it also means is that if those identities are marginalized, then you become the recipient of discrimination as a result of the identities that you may hold. A perfect example of this that I think we can all understand is that if you are an African-American Muslim, then your racial identity is a distinct form of discrimination that you may experience. And that may be different than the discrimination that you may experience as a result of your religious identity as a Muslim. And those two can intersect, and then your experiences throughout the day can be informed by the intersection of those identities that you have. So I think in framing our understanding of the Shia Muslim psychological well-being and mental health experience, it's going to be really important for us to be aware and have the language to be able to talk about intersectionality. And that is the intersection of folks who identify as Shia in their identity as a Muslim person and the experiences that they have as a Muslim. And then within mostly within Muslim spaces, their identity as a Shia and how that influences their daily activities and their daily experiences, first in terms of their identity development, but then also in terms of the kinds of discrimination that they may face. And I think it's going to be really important for us to understand what are some of the consequences of discrimination in general. So when somebody experiences discrimination because of a social identity that they hold, a lot of the literature has historically talked about, and I mean, I think as you can, a lot of it is just intuitive. If you face discrimination, it can have, if you just think about it for a second, it could have, I'm sure every person here can think of a negative consequence that can come and be born out of experiences with discrimination. We have so much literature that talks about the influences of discrimination on people's psychological well-being, physical well-being, physiological stress markers, and et cetera, et cetera. But there are two important points here that I want to kind of delve deeper into and have us pay attention to its nuance in terms of the experiences of the Shia Muslim experience in the US. The first one is this idea of intersectionality. So the pernicious consequences of discrimination are, we can say there's an additive because of this holding the identity as a Shia Muslim. There's this additive because, and the intersectionality that exists, there's this additive experience with discrimination that is then compounded with whatever other identity the person experiences. So think of it as this compounded experience with the adversity that comes with experiencing discrimination. Another less talked about area that pertains to discrimination and how it influences a person's psychological well-being is the idea of resilience. So there is this emerging idea that when folks experience discrimination, whether it's personally experiencing it or perceiving it, like the brother was talking about, so experiencing the threat of discrimination, even if you aren't necessarily directly discriminated against, it can actually confer some positive results as well. Things such as bringing groups closer together. So one of the, I think, most kind of broad categories of the quote unquote positive consequences of experiencing discrimination or perceived discrimination is that groups tend to get closer to each other. You experience a higher level of community cohesion, and that community cohesion can then confer a protective layer for folks. Another positive consequence can be that folks may experience themselves and develop the sense of self-efficacy and feel empowered to stand up against that source of discrimination, which then kind of builds self-esteem, and it builds this ability to be able to stand up to the discrimination and have a purpose in guiding their life. All of these, what we may call positive consequences, and I do air quotes because we can definitely talk about how are we defining positive, but all of these quote unquote positive consequences of discrimination I think can be understood as the person's resilience. So one of the things that I think is going to be really important for us to take into account when we're thinking about the mental health and psychological well-being of the Shia community is the enormous amount of resilience that they experience on a daily basis and have built on a daily basis. So what is resilience? We want to be a little bit specific about how we define resilience because it's usually just kind of thrown around without being very clear about what we mean by it. Resilience, at least within a psychological field, has to be specifically defined as an adaptive response to a specific psychological stressor. So there has to be a specific adverse experience that the person has. And then the person's ability to be able to either adapt in a way that does not cause them distress, or the distress that does not cause a lot of negative consequences for them, or that actually allows them to flourish. So notice the two different distinctions here. When you experience an adversity, resilience is either the ability to not be impacted by it, your well-being not be impacted by it, or to flourish, to not only not be impacted by it, but to also flourish. And a lot of these quote unquote positive consequences of discrimination is born out of the population's resilience in being able to adapt to the multiple different forms of discrimination that they may face. In the specific experiences of Shia populations, I think it's really important for us to recognize all the different forms of resilience that the community has exhibited in specifically, so remember how I said it has to be contextualized in that specific, to the specific adversity, towards the specific experience of facing discrimination as a result of their Shia identity. The Shia community has, individuals and community has built this individual and collective resilience around being able to adapt, not being necessarily influenced by it, the strength in not being able to be strong in its face and not allowing it to impact their well-being, or being able to flourish. But here's what is typically the conversation, here's what we typically forget to discuss. There is a cost associated with resilience. While it's really important to talk about and value people's ability to have resilience in the face of any adversity and in the face of any tragedy, and while there is for Shia populations, the sources of resilience can primarily be rooted in, first and foremost, their belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his the strength that he confers. And in addition to that, resilience being motivated by the lives of the Ahlul Bayt and the family of the Prophet sallallahu and his family. While this folks have built this sense of resilience from these faith-based sources, it's really important for us to recognize that there is a cost associated with resilience. So we have decades of studies on how there can be such a thing as too much resilience. When you have additive and compounded experiences with discrimination, remember the idea of intersectionality that I mentioned initially. When you have compounded experiences with discrimination and adversities, the resilience that individuals come up with, while it is commendable and it is adaptive and allows people to be able to function and continue to be strong in the face of those adversities, there is a cost associated with it. And that cost is something called the allostatic load. So the idea of allostatic load is that as their allostatic load initially came up as a physiological concept, but then later was taken up by the psychological field to refer to people's ability to be able to, when people experience a stressor, for them to be able to get themselves back to their safe. And remember how Dr. Awad initially mentioned that people's sense of safety can be jeopardized. So when the person experiences this threat to their safety, their ability to bring themselves back to a safe space, so be able to perceive the world as a safe space, that psychological process of having to do that over and over and over again in a compounded way. So speaking specifically about the experiences of Shias, in this compounded way, can contribute to something called an allostatic load. Think of it as a wear and tear on the person's ability to be able to regulate their stress physiology. And I think this is a nuanced point that usually we forget to talk about when we're talking about resilience. Resilience is important. Resilience is there. Resilience is strength that all communities that are discriminated against have the ability to exhibit. And specifically in the experiences of Shia populations, we certainly see this across so many different domains. But it's important to recognize that there is a cost, both physiological and psychological, to this continuous self-regulation and ability to be able to be resilient. There's a cost associated with being resilient. And often what we talk about in this idea, in this like headspace of allostatic load, is that instead of the individual assuming the responsibility of being resilient, it's important for us to do something about the source of what is requiring the person to be resilient against. I'd like to close by just kind of thinking about directions and areas that we can focus on when thinking about the mental health and psychological well-being of the followers of the Ahlul Bayt. And the most important point that I want us to think about is contextualizing folks' experiences and not assuming a homogeneity in people's experiences with discrimination, and not assuming that because we see a person of any background really, but in this particular case, the experience of a Shia Muslim, to not assume that all experiences are the same. Folks' experiences tend to be very complex, very heterogeneous, and it's really important to contextualize the person's experience in their environment. So here are a few areas for us, questions for us to ask when we're thinking about building programs or initiatives in terms of how to improve the psychological well-being and mental health of Shia Muslims. Here are a couple of important ideas, or a few important ideas to take into account. One of the first ideas is to think about what is the most prominent source of discrimination or distress for that group. Is it actually coming from a within group source of discrimination? So is it that the person may experience or feel more unsafe or threatened or discomfort or not a sense of belonging as a result of their identity as a Shia or as a Muslim? Or maybe it could actually be, maybe it could be gender, maybe it could be socioeconomic status. It's important for us to ask. It's important for us to not assume what is the most prominent source of distress for the person, and then be able to contextualize programs and services and whatever there may be in that specific context. Another question to ask is age and the developmental standing of folks. The kinds of questions and the kinds of programs that we may build will be very different if we're thinking about the experiences of Shia kindergartners versus folks who may be on university campuses navigating all sorts of different identities, and let's say the elderly. Why is this important? Because the experiences of folks with age, especially given the historical trauma that Shias have faced in different parts of the country, can be rooted in the next idea, which is immigration history. So the experiences of folks who may have had firsthand experiences with genocide, with extreme levels of violence around the identity as a Shia person, may be very different than a person who may not have experienced that historical trauma and that very vivid experience with that level of violence. And I think another question that is important is to think about what is the level of resources and strength that the local Shia community has to offer to the individual, and what does that look like? In spaces where there is none, and when there is no kind of social space where that, remember the sense of social cohesion that I mentioned in the beginning, if that is absolutely absent, we think about this idea of how this person's psychological well-being may be influenced very differently than there's a very robust sense of community that already exists for the person to be interacting within. And I think it's very important to be asking ourselves some of these questions in order to contextualize how we think about, and maybe some of the conversation that we can have afterwards about what it looks like to build some of these programs, initiatives, conversations for taking care of the psychological and spiritual well-being of the Shia community. I'm going to end with that and inshallah pass it on to the next speaker.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. I wanted to just share some quick points. I was asked to discuss how can the Sunni Muslim community be supportive of the Shia Muslim community on a communal level, as well as individually, what are some of the things that we might be able to do as Sunni Muslims in the face of anti-Shia hatred and bigotry. And I think to frame some of this within a lived experience can be very, very important. And so anecdotally, I wanted to share with you all an interaction that Shaykh Faiyez Jaffer and I had some years ago with a young man that visited our Islamic Center at New York University. He had come for the first time and was there with a social worker and a lawyer who were both working with him directly on a case as he was an asylum seeker from Pakistan, but were also there because they were both Muslim and wanted to introduce him to a Muslim community that he could be a part of. And they called me down to the lobby of our facility in New York University, saying that he won't enter into the building. And so I came and I spoke to him and tried to encourage him. I even talked to him in Urdu, hoping that there could be that familiarity. And everything that I said to him rendered very little response. And he just existed in this kind of quietude. And so I inquired to the social worker as well as the lawyer, what is it that's going on here? And they gave me some insight that this young man was a Shia Muslim who had fled from his home country after members of his family who were Shia also were killed because they were Shia. And he had spent so many years prior to leaving from his home country because of the targeted killings that his family had experienced, pretending that he was Sunni, and that was the only way that he could frequent any type of spaces that he went in because he feared for his life. And now his hesitancy in coming into our center was that I knew he was Shia. He didn't have a chance to pretend that he was Sunni, and he didn't know what to do because he didn't know what he would be met with. And so I called Shaykh Faiyez Jaffer and said, can you come downstairs and speak to this brother? And Shaykh Faiyez spoke to him, gave him encouragement and support in the ways that only he could. And he then entered into our center and joined us there for the various services we were hosting on that day. Why I want to contextualize this is, one, I shared some of this as part of a broader statement that I made post the New Mexico tragedies, where we saw individuals killed because of their Shia identity. And when I shared it, there was many who were supportive, many who shared, sentiments that were similar. But I had a good number of people who also I very directly, it was clear that they simply just said, this didn't happen, that we don't think it actually took place. The only other time where I've had somebody say that to me is when I've returned from Myanmar on a couple of visits, dealing with the Rohingya population facing ethnic cleansing and genocide. May Allah make things easy for them. And I was giving presentations at various universities, and one I was doing at a university for the entire student body. And some young men came up to me afterwards who identified themselves as being Caucasian, part of a fraternity. And I showed literal images of what was taking place on the ground. And they said to me, we just don't think this is actually taking place. And that denial, I think, is a first frame that we have to understand what it means to be a support mechanism, both individually and communally. Because the only way to break out of that denial is through very real education. And that education is not a responsibility of the minority demographic, that the majority demographic of Sunni Muslims has to impose upon our Shia brothers and sisters to say, it's your responsibility to educate us, but rather it's our responsibility to get educated. Both as a mechanism to deal with our own denials, as well as to start to diminish the denial that exists amongst many members of our community. We want to get to a place where the breaking down and dismantling of some of these experiences that exist on a global level, and as the prior speakers highlighted, exist also both directly as well as residual impact of what happens internationally on a domestic level here in the United States, is something that can only now start to be broken down as a first step of education. To gain knowledge, to gain understanding, to understand historically what the experiences are like, what the struggle is like, what the sociological understandings of some of this ends up being, as well as how it is trickling down on a day-to-day level. And that narrative is something that many of us in the Sunni community do not hear, are not engaged on. It becomes very purposely, I would argue, erased quite often for a variety of reasons. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't still exist and it doesn't take place. And so individually, we get to a place where we seek that education. That second component as a subset to the education is for us to then be able to also confront our own innate biases, our stereotypes, and intellectual laziness that we might not recognize exists within us, but it's there. One of the paradoxes of decision-making is that when you don't make a choice, you've essentially chosen. And an unconscious framing of what it is that you or I as a Sunni Muslim believe a Shia Muslim to be, simply through a cognitive function that can have benefits, but in this instance, it renders a deep detriment where we start to now stereotype in the most negative of ways. And so just understanding what it is that we can do to educate ourselves. How can you do that? Well, you can find within yourself whatever it is that breaks down obstacles, and you go and you seek understanding and insight from the demographic that you're seeking to learn from. Not with a savior complex, not with an understanding of how you respond, but just to educate yourself, just to learn. What is the actual Shia experience in the United States, in your local community, in your city, globally? And you just take in and you listen and you absorb and you seek to understand. I think a second step to that we can do intentionally is to set for ourselves what is the motivation behind this, the why of what it is that I'm seeking to do. Because a firm intention is going to then create for us a necessary strategy, both as an individual and as a community. And on the other end, when we deal with this, whether we're talking about it in a spiritual framework or we're talking about it in terms of just systems and structurally, organized evil will always triumph over disorganized righteousness. That is just truth. whether we accept it or not, it's fact. And so for us now to not have an intention that I'm going to make myself feel better, but I'm recognizing the need for me to have strategy in order to achieve an objective or a goal is rooted in me determining before I move forward, why am I doing this in the first place? And that why has to be rooted in something concrete so that I'm doing it, whether it's easy or not, whether it's difficult or not, whether it's convenient or not. And I want you to go back to the frame that I started with anecdotally. People are literally being killed because they're Shia. And if we can say and recognize that that's the case, and we have capacity to do something about this, but we're simply choosing not to, that's a problem. So you have to think now in the motivation. What's going to get me to be educated? What's going to get me to leverage my privilege? What's going to get me to be real in my solidarity? I have to trickle down to a why that makes sense. And I think within that, a recognition that it's not going to be the simplest of things to do, that you are going to not have to deal with honesty, but thirdly, you're going to have to deal with vulnerability. And that vulnerability is going to necessitate you having to deal with things that make you uncomfortable. You're going to have to be in a place where that discomfort is now something that you are willing to sit with, because what comfort allows for us to do is create spaces that become devoid of compassion, devoid of empathy, devoid of real recognition of what the lived experience is of those that are other than us. And so you want to root this thirdly in a pursuit that allows for you to embrace vulnerability, to not adopt what it is that we see in other circumstances where majority demographics cannot handle their own fragility. And because they can't handle their fragility, they continue to perpetuate anti-Blackness, bigotry, hatred, systemic and structural modes of oppression, just because it doesn't feel good to confront what it is that they have to willfully confront in order to move past some of this. That vulnerability is going to fourthly then create an opportunity to have to confront and recognize the ways that we might benefit from an exclusion, ostracization, a vilification at times, and even demonizing, right? It's not just about polemics and polemical understandings or distinct understandings of theology and law and practice, but it renders now a narrative that is rooted in these misconceptions of the other that create constructs of fear that then lend towards end conclusions that can be quite fatal. And so we can only break down something when we're fully willing to understand what are the ways that I benefit from it? What are the ways that I might have gains and advantages that I'm still willing to let go of? I think a big part of this is also working towards a recognition of just the humanization of this demographic that we are deeply in need of as Sunni Muslims being better supporters of. That you can go into likely most, and this is a generalization, overt generalization. I don't like making generalizations. The work that I do as a chaplain, I try my best to see people as specifics. But a generalization I'm comfortable making, you can go into most Sunni spaces, schools, masjids, just talk to everyday people and see what it is that they understand of their Shia Muslim brothers and sisters. Not on a knowledge level, but on a just comfort level, on a humanizing level. Where does like the sense of humanization stop at that point? The recognition of some of this, I think, has to be rooted, fifthly, in an empathetic mode of engagement. Empathy, to me, is one of the pinnacles of spiritual kind of actualization in our tradition, because true empathy necessitates a suspending of the ego, everything that feeds and fuels it, and you simply now understand the experience of the other through what they go through. It requires me to just simply listen and to recognize that there's certain things that some people go through that the rest of us will never see. And there's certain things that others will experience that we might not ever experience. And I think what empathy is very critical about as well is that it becomes now a key conduit to the development of love, real mahabba, where we have numerous narrations in our traditions that say integral to the completion of our individual faith is just simply having a love for people because they're people, love for humanity. What that empathy allows and that love allows for is also a disruption to cyclical patterns of shame, right? And I'm not trying to speak about something that's not my expertise. I know Dr. Rania is here and Sister Zainab Hossaini is here and so many more who could speak to this 100 times better. But where you have literal cycles of shame that give us responses, right? You will respond in a mode of withdrawal, avoidance. You will attack yourself or you will attack someone else as you are wrestling with the shame that you carry, not knowing what to do. I don't know what I should do when clearly there is bias that is taking place in my community. I don't know what to do when the person on the member doesn't even acknowledge how they're fueling some of this bias. I don't know what to do when people want to pretend like we're really together and unified when we actually are not, because they're more worried about optics and PR and what people will say, rather than getting to the roots of what the actual challenges are and recognizing that their dismissiveness is causing a lot of harm and pain to others. When that shame sits with me, it doesn't have me respond necessarily in the best of ways for me to break out of it and to start to be true in my solidarity. That empathy is a great disruptor, a great way to cultivate real love and understanding. A couple of other practical things that I would say that we could do is one, as you start to recognize how anti-Shia bias just manifests, what it is that gives birth to it, but also what allows for it to flourish, you want to become a person and a community that is made up of persons like this that start to become disruptive of that. You don't want to tolerate jokes that take place because they're not funny. You don't want to be in a space where you recognize that there's responsibility, but you don't do anything about it, right? We say, Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim, not so that we can just understand that that path is there and then not walk it, but you ask for that guidance so that you can traverse the path, not just acknowledge its existence, but you move on it. So as you learn about what these things are, you want to then take the step to also do what you can to disrupt it. And a last piece that I would say before I pass it on is that you want to then pass on different things generationally, right? There has to be a stopping point. And you start to educate younger generations, your own children, on what this means through a distinct framing of a narrative. We have to deal with the fact that there are realities rooted in geopolitical conflicts. There are influences that determine how it is that we see those that are other than us in these ways. And the realities are that this can be quite fatal. Shaykh Faiyez can tell you this better than I could, but I don't know in how many of the last years in the month of Muharram where there hasn't been specific targeting of congregations of Shia Muslims in different parts of the world, knowing that they are going to be gathering in the month of Muharram in the ways that they do, and they are now dealing with explosions, attacks, bombings, all different kinds of things. This is a reality. This is a reality that most Muslim college spaces in the United States tend to be dominated by men who are South Asian and are Sunni Muslim. And those who do not fit into those boxes, including our Shia sisters and brothers, they tend to not have space for themselves. We get to a place where we recognize that no one should be made to feel alone. And education on this is also very important. What I don't think is necessary is that we have to feign an outward unity that is externalized. But a uniformity that we share is one that is more internalized, shared values, shared hearts. And Shaykh Faiyez and I were talking about this, and we're hoping in the coming weeks to put out more in terms of content, writings, etc., that say, well, how do you create essentially a functional space that allows for people to be true to who they are in their identity without necessarily being devoid of respect that is reciprocated? And I think much of the framing around this that he, very insightfully gave to me was that many people are responding, even in the aftermath of what took place in New Mexico, through a prism of like a masjid context only. And there's so much more context that we can understand these things in. So just a quick recap, seek out your local Shia Muslim community, leaders, academics, scholars. Shaykh Faiyez offered this, and I'm just going to echo his offer. You should reach out to him. He's a great resource. He can give you answers, book lists, so much else. In your communities, don't just invite Shia scholars to speak on Shiaism or on Shia Sunni kind of joint programs, but gain an insight into a variety of topics that if we were to put this in another minority experience, right? If you only invite to your community people who self-identify as Black during Black History Month to talk about what it means to be, in association with their Blackness alone, then you're cutting yourself off from so many gains and benefits. And then lastly, make a firm intention. We can be better than this. We can allow for ourselves to not have those whose lives were lost be done in vain, but we can recognize what it is that we work towards collectively, and an understanding that there's benefit in all of us. Fundamentally, you just have to really think in an education format, who is Muslim? And what are we teaching to people in terms of who still fits within the broader framework intent of Islam in that sense? And how we have a unique opportunity here, especially in the United States, to serve as an example for others that say that we're not going to just bow down to the ease and comfort that comes from denying minority experience. But we're going to remember who our God is, that there's a bigger world in store for us than this one. And we're going to do what's right simply because it's the right thing to do. Wallahu ta'ala alam wa billahi tawfiq. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Imam Khalid. MashaAllah, and for all of our panelists here, I'm really so touched by everything that has been shared and said. Also, I wanted to welcome and just remind everybody as I do some, inshallah, kind of remarks that bring us all together here towards the end, is to please use the Q&A box to put in your questions. Inshallah, we're going to have two options for being able to engage with you tonight, because we want to hear everybody's questions and voices, either through the Q&A.
Alhamdu hamdan zahiran tayyiban mubarakan fi ila yawmiddin. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad fil awwalin wa fil akhirin. Allahumma ja'alna min al-mukhlisin. Allahumma ja'alna min al-mukhlisin. Allahumma ja'alna min al-mukhlisin. We begin this supplication in your name, Ya Allah. Beseech you to send your choicest salutations upon your most beloved, sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. We come today to remember all those that we tragically lost in New Mexico, as well as all those who have been victim to anti-Shia bias throughout the world. Shower upon them and us your infinite mercy, and grant all of us only the best in this world and the best in the next. Guide the footsteps of our brothers and sisters and deepen us in our trust, love, and care for them and each other, so that we might come together to help them at this time. Send them only those who will be their helpers and supporters, and protect them from any further affliction, anxiety, or anguish. Open their hearts to receive all of the love that we are sending them on this day, and envelop them in your divine love always, Ya Wadud. Grant them peace, relax their fears, and remove from them any impediment that keeps them from doing all that they are able to do. The burdens of life sometimes seem too heavy to bear. The anxiety and anguish that sits inside of us feels bigger at times than the world around us. We seem to be surrounded by a darkness that is impenetrable. Today, we ask you, for the sake of our brothers and sisters who need us to be better than our best, to give us courage. Our struggles are real, but your promise is true. Indeed, with hardship, there always comes ease. Remove from our hearts any fears or inhibitions, and replace them with an ever-increasing boldness to live each moment as best as we can. Fill our hearts with a fire of your love and a desire for nothing less than justice for all. Make us the conveyors of truth, the purveyors of truth, the couriers, the carriers, the upholders of truth. Let us not be swayed by false fulfillment, but make us from amongst those who taste true contentment. Help us to see this world always through hearts that are drawn towards goodness, to silence fear and abolish anxiety, to overpower indifference and break away from greed, to eliminate arrogance and defeat racism, to be bold enough to ask of you to make us those who only do that which is good. Help us to be above what is simply normal and to never compromise on who it is that we are for those who only accept us when we become that which we are not. To see our race, our heritage, our class, our gender as a means of strength and never something that we wish wasn't a part of us. To never fear the path of truth for the lack of people walking on it. And bless us, Ya Rabbi, with leaders to follow who walk firmly upon it. Let our unity be not tied to uniformity of the external, but instead make us sisters and brothers of all colors in our unity to be based off of a uniformity of our values and hearts. Remove from our hearts any negative thoughts of others and help us to never partake in acts of injustice against people of background. Even if no one else speaks, help us to always speak against any oppression, even if it means speaking against ourselves. Love your creation through us. Be gentle to them through us. Increase them in strength through us. Give them courage through us. Help them grow through us. Endow them with confidence through us. Fill them with sincerity through us. Protect them always through us. And through us bring good and benefit to the rest of this world. Ya Arhamar Rahimin, most merciful of those who show mercy. Let our anger be only at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that we will work for justice, equality, and peace. Let our tears shed only for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and conflict, so that we will reach out our hands to comfort them and change their pain into joy. And let our successes be many, as we make a difference in this world by doing the things which others say cannot be done. For our brothers and sisters in the Shia community, those in New Mexico, their loved ones, their family members, and all those who are facing any type of hardship in the world at this time, we simply ask for peace. Protect us always from hearts that are not humble, tongues that are not wise, and eyes that have forgotten how to cry. Forgive us for our shortcomings and guide and bless us all. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
Thank you so much for that beautiful dua. And with that, we thank you all for joining us and are most grateful to our speakers for having illuminated our hearts and minds tonight. Inshallah, we look forward to seeing you at our next program soon. Assalamu alaikum.